Patch 9.1.5 is here, and with it comes the removal of several restrictions preventing you from swapping covenants easily. I'm sure there are a lot of Guardian Druid players out there wondering, should I be leveling another covenant to use, and if so, in what situations are each of the different covenants useful? I'll be looking deeper into both questions in this video, specifically looking at both rating and Mythic Plus. Remember though, if you found this video useful, be sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel for more content like it, and let's start off with raids. Night Fae has definitely been the dominant raid covenant so far this expansion, and it's for a good reason. Very powerful soul binds, access to a blink, as well as giving a single target burst CD. Night Fae is just good all around choice for raids and has been hard to pass up with the covenant restrictions. If we're talking about progression rating, I think it's likely that for most bosses, you'll see Guardians stick to this Night Fae covenant. However, with the added flexibility, I think you may start to see some Kyrian bears pop up on specific bosses. Kyrian specifically shines in situations where you aren't going to be able to catweave either very much or at all, and whenever there is a scary bleed that you can use your file to clear. The Kindred Affinity legendary also provides a very good overall DPS increase to your raid, and while it may not show up on your meters, depending on who you're linked with, it has the potential to do more damage than any other covenant. Both Necrolord and Venthyr are still fine if that's your preference. The extra defensive from Fleshcraft can be nice, albeit unnecessary for Guardian Druid specifically, and Venthyr can pump in AoE fights, but moving forward, I think you'll continue to see the dominance of Night Fae in raids with some Kyrian bears thrown in situationally. Then we have Mythic Plus, which is a whole lot more complicated. It changes depending on both dungeon you're going into and the affixes that week. Right off the bat, your number one priority should be making sure that your group has the dungeon-specific covenant buff. Guardian Druids are great at flexing for your group depending on what you need, as all the covenants are fine choices. Even Necrolord, who doesn't really shine in Mythic Plus, is more than usable. I actually played Necrolord Guardian all of Season 1 because our group lacked a Necrolord, and it was more than fine. Getting those dungeon buffs is the single most impactful thing you can do if they aren't already covered. In terms of specific covenant things, I think Night Fae, Venthyr, and even Kyrian has their place. Just like in raids, Night Fae is the great generalist option for all the same reasons, right? Extra mobility, great soul binds, Convoke providing solid burst damage when you're able to use it in chicken form. Venthyr, on the other hand, kind of lets you double down on the strengths of Guardian Druid during Incarnation, and it doesn't require you to be able to shift into Boomkin form to get the most offensive output from your ability. Finally, Kyrian, it's a bit more niche, specifically for like necrotic weak keys, as File will help you clear those stacks and make it just a lot easier to deal with in general. But a lot of the offensive strengths of Kyrian is actually tied into the raid section, because you can't really use the Kindred Affinity legendary, where a lot of that offensive power comes from, because Ursoc's Fury exists, right? You can't justify replacing Ursoc's Fury with that Kyrian legendary in Mythic Plus, just not something you can do. So maybe we can revisit this if we can ever wear 2 legendaries at a time. Kyrian may see a big boost in that situation, but until then I think Kyrian's going to be very, very niche, either if you need the Kyrian dungeon buff specifically, or if it's like a necrotic week. So that means for the most part you're going to be switching between Night Fae and Venthyr depending on the dungeon, with Venthyr being better in dungeons where you're always able to do big pulls around Incarn CD, as well as when you have the ability to pull things like trash mobs on top of bosses, and Night Fae shining when you're able to Boomkin Convoke consistently, or when you're able to abuse something like First Strike. Going through the list here, let's just go through all the dungeons. Again, assuming you have the Covenant buff covered, because your number one priority should be covering that buff, if it's not already, but let's assume that your group for all these already has the Covenant buff covered. So go through the list. The other side, I think the other side, you could go either way. You can get Convokes off on all of the bosses, which can be extremely important depending on how you're handling Musela, for example, as well as in the Ardenwald Wing, right? It's pretty safe to kite, and you're safe to Boomkin Convoke away from the mobs because you have that distance, and they don't really have a ton of ranged attacks in there. And you are pulling the Ardenwald Wing fairly quickly. You really only have the opportunity to incarn twice in the Ardenwald Wing, like once when you get in and once near the end. So you're doing all those big pulls, most of them in the middle, without incarn anyways. With that said, both of these incarn pulls are quite large. You're pulling onto like the lieutenant at the beginning, and if the affix permit, onto the boss at the end, right? So you can get a ton of Ravenous Frenzy value and damage in those pulls if you're running Venthyr. It can also help out with some of these scarier pulls throughout the dungeon that you can't really convoke, right? Like the Mechagon Dog pull, as well as the Urn pull in Hakar's Wing, right? So overall, your choice in this dungeon really depends on how you're rooting, how big you're pulling in these various areas, how big you're pulling with Incarn in these various areas, and whether or not you're going to be pulling trash onto bosses that specific week. So it's a bit, this is kind of like a dealer's choice. So if you feel comfortable with Venthyr in this dungeon, play Venthyr. Otherwise, you can play Night Fae. Both will work here. Moving on to the other Ardenwold dungeon, Mists, definitely a Night Fae dungeon. Heart and Convoke have insane value on the first boss because of that damage amp, and you're forced to pull relatively small throughout the dungeon, just because of the maze, and even early on in the dungeon, you don't really have a ton of opportunity to pull things together. So you're only really getting those big pull value from Ravenous Frenzy plus Incarn at the end of the dungeon with the bugs, but even then, I mean, that's not enough value for the whole dungeon in my opinion. So definitely recommend going Night Fae in Mists. Halls of Atonement, by contrast, is definitely a Venthyr dungeon. You're able to do a big pull basically whenever you want, whenever Incarn is on CD, for the beginning of the dungeon, and then also the trash between the second and third boss. So you can get really, really, really good value from your Incarn plus Ravenous Frenzy, and at the same time, it's super difficult to get a safe Boomkin Convoke off on trash because of those wicked bolts flying around everywhere. So opposite of Miss here. Halls, definitely a Venthyr dungeon in my book. Sanguine Depths, I think, is another one that kind of depends on your rooting and whether you can pull trash onto bosses again. If you're able to add trash onto specifically the middle two bosses with full urn stacks running, your value for being Venthyr just goes way, way up, and Night Fear goes way down. On the other hand, if you can't do this because of something like bolstering, necrotic, and instead you're just going into these bosses solo with urn stacks, you're going to be able to get off some huge convokes on the bosses. And so depending on your rooting here and affixes, either will work. You just need to kind of adjust this with the affixes and your root. Theater of Pain, I think I definitely prefer Night Fae here. This is one of those dungeons, just like Miss, where you're forced to kind of do a lot of small pulls. You have a couple big pulls in here in the Abomination Wing throughout the dungeon, but you're really not going to get consistent value from being Venthyr. There's also a couple bosses in here where First Strike is very, very good, the Abomination Wing boss and the last boss in particular, and you have Convoke opportunities on pretty much every boss and a lot of the trash as well, and those mini bosses as well, like big single target damage for that. You can get it on a couple of them, so definitely prefer the Night Fae and Convoke in this dungeon. Plaguefall, another Night Fae dungeon in my opinion. This one is a bit closer though. You can get some pretty good Ravenous Frenzy pulls in the first half of the dungeon, but after that, not so much. The problem though is that for the most part, single target damage is just so much more important in Plaguefall and AoE, because the scariest moments in this dungeon, even on Fortified Week, are the bosses. Right, you're able to squeak in Boom Convokes on every single boss in this dungeon here, on top of just heavily abusing First Strike on, I think, all the bosses as well. Not so much the second boss, but the other three bosses. So Night Fae, ton of value here, helps out on all the bosses, gives you extra burst on all the bosses. It's very, very, very good in this dungeon, even though you can get some good value from Ravenous Frenzy. Spires, second last dungeon here, another one that can go either way. There are a bunch of big Incarn pulls before the second boss. You end up getting like 70-ish% of your trash, I believe, including a pack that you can pull on top of the first boss, again, affixes permitting. At the same time, though, Oriferion has that damage amp, just like Mist of Tyrannus Scythe, so Heart plus Convoke in that damage amp has a lot of value. Not to mention, Convoke is very good against the Angel mini-bosses, and you get a couple of casts off on Davos as well. So this, again, rooting dependent, group dependent, depending on how you want to deal with those various trash pulls early on and those bosses later on. Necrotic Wake, similar story with the potential for big pulls close to Incarn CD throughout the dungeon. Very, very nice for Venthyr Bears, but also has several bosses that favor Night Fae, with the first two allowing you to get really good First Strike uptime and Convoke shining on that last boss, where you can solo one of the boss's shields. Well, as I've said for many dungeons now, it's going to depend on 1, can you pull trash on the bosses? 2, your routing, depending on whether or not you have big pulls spaced out for Incarn, and 3, how easily your group can handle getting rid of those shields on the last boss, because as you get into higher keys, especially Tyrannical, that is going to be one of the biggest pain points of this dungeon, the last boss and breaking those shields without your team dying. So in conclusion, bears are pretty flexible, able to swap to any Covenant needed across the board without a huge hit to their performance. For talking raids, Night Fae is likely going to remain the go-to Covenant. It's a great generalist Covenant for progression, and Kyrian is good situationally. When it comes to Mythic Plus, the best choice will always be the Covenant that gets you your dungeon buff if your group is lacking it. Otherwise, it's going to be a toss-up between Night Fae and Venthyr depending on the dungeon, route, group composition, and that week's affixes. That is all for this video though, guys. Hopefully this helps you decide when and where to play which Covenant on Guardian Druids. I know personally I am going to be doing that Renown grind for all 4 Covenants, so I'll be prepared for anything. But if you don't want to do that, hopefully this video helps you decide which Covenant to land on for the content that you plan on doing. If you have any questions at all, feel free to drop a comment down below or come stop by my Twitch channel at Tactics, where I stream high keys and mythic rating from a Guardian Druid's perspective. Otherwise, thanks for watching, and I'll see you all in the next video.